One still night in 1897, a kingdom's heart was set on fire. Bronze faces stood silently by as fire consumed their home, and with it, Africa's soul was laid bare. Night air over Benin City clung with secrets. It was scented with red soil and palm oil, the market giggles laughter now lost in the kind of silence that harbored catastrophe in its lips. The silver moonlight swirled around the high palace walls, every one of the bronze plaques glowing softly like 1,000 closed eyes. Inside the throne room, Oba Ovenramwan lounged on his leopard-wood stool with elaborate carvings and draped in coral beads recounting centuries of unchallenged authority. His chiefs, draped in white wraps, spoke in hushed tones. Outside the streets, the city drums wheezed, their rhythm breaking into macabre silence. Far outside the city walls, shadows changed in the forest, not specters but troops. British soldiers, over 200 of them, moved in column. Their boots plunged into the wet jungle soil, their rifles slung low, bayonets shining in the moon like teeth bared. They began with more than gunpowder, crowbars, sacks, and tin cans. They didn't intend to come back with empty hands. The forest was still as they came. Guards stationed by the palace gates heard the soft clanging of metal. One took a step forward, peering into the darkness, and then the initial bullet had been fired. A man fell. A second, third, before thunder consumed silence. Flames lit as torches whirled overhead, landing on the roofs of nearby huts. The Beninese scrambled onto pandemonium, mothers carrying babies, priests gathering religious items, warriors dashing with spears clutched in their hands towards the sound of guns. The British moved fast, bursting through bronze gates with a ripping of wood and metal. Inside the palace, the holy shrines flashed under the unsteady light, shrines that sheltered ivory tusks standing as tall as a man, beaded coral masks, and tablets containing the histories of former kings. The conquerors barely broke their stride to ogle. They ripped the bronzes from the walls, pried the ivory from the pedestals, and pitched centuries of craftsmanship into their crates, as if they were loading baskets with wood. The Oba chiefs had cried in vain for the riches to be hidden. The rooms were empty. Coral necklaces were ripped from statues, ancestor altars shattered, and the floorboards themselves taken out in search of gold. The air was heavy with smoke, obscuring the sky. Benin City was no longer a dawn jewel. It was devastation. Ash rained on the streets like snow, covering the gutted drums, the shattered carvings, and the corpses of those who had fought and died defending it. Brandies and boxes waited to set sail on the sea, each a fragment of a stolen soul. And in the ruins, the Oba himself, Benin's king, was led into captivity in chains. The world would be awed by the Benin Bronzes, but never hear the cries of the night that they were taken. They left the burning city behind. But the real quest for the plundered bronzes was only just about to start. The dawn following the fall of Benin lay in an eerie quiet. Smoke still curled into the thick sky, drifting aimlessly above the smoldering rubble. Up the Palace Avenue, British soldiers marched in cold steel unison, piling their spoils into wooden boxes adorned with royal crests, not Obas, queens. Each box creaked under the load of history. Bronze plaques showing kings in their finery, ivory masks whose gaze followed you, coral-encrusted skulls that had once protected ancestor altars. At the edge of the city, the river Benin stood silently by. Black water lapped around the burden of barges already loaded with booty. Sweat-stained soldiers mopped brows as they hoisted the last load on board, boots crunching onto holy soil. Whimpers of the homeless drifted out weakly in the distance, an ectoplasmic shadow of what had been abandoned. The barges went downstream, their loads burlap-wrapped and wax-sealed. Along the banks, the Benin waited in silence, some crouched behind palms, others standing bull-strong and in plain sight. An old woman lifted her arms to the river and spat a curse, low but poisonous, that drifted across water. The soldiers had no idea what she called upon, but the interpreter did. "May the sea devour what you have taken." As the barges swept into the estuary, the Atlantic stretched out before them, gray, cold, and endless. Moored in the distance was a British steamer, its iron deck towering above the wooden barges. The bronzes were drawn aboard, the crates swinging in the sea air before thudding on the steel deck. Officers marched down the line, reading manifests, taking notes. In the captain's cabin, a wire message lay waiting. Shipment to London. Handle with care. It started beneath a canopy of rain. The bow was pounded by waves, thrusting the deck forward as gulls screamed overhead. Day merged into night, the bronzes below deck in the hold, out of sight in the stench of coal smoke and salt. Soldiers passed the time smoking cigarettes and playing poker, never once looking at the art they had pilfered. But the sea did remember. Storms rolled in off the west, and the ship pitched like a beast, iron hull groaning with each wave. Below in the hold, the bronzes stirred in their crates, as if restive, as if they were being borne great distances away from the land of birth. Weeks afterward, the Thames deposited them into the cold arms of London. Fog shrouded the quaysides as cranes lowered the crates onto waiting wagons. No one here knew of the city where they were taken. No one here knew the smell of that night. To the dockworkers, they were nothing but African artifacts, valuable, perhaps, but without their past. The bronzes were taken away to storerooms, entered by clerks who mutilated their names, and placed in glass cases under the chilly, unnatural light of an extraterrestrial museum. Herds of tourists poured in to marvel at their beauty, tracing with the eye the fine carvings, unaware they looked upon pillaged phantasms. The journey was over, but the exile had only just begun. London, they were no longer treasures of a kingdom. They were trophies of an empire. The crates were pushed into the heart of the British Museum on a wet London morning. Rain-slicked cobblestone roads as horse-drawn wagons pulled the spoils through town, through shopkeepers in doorway lines, mouths agape, through schoolchildren in doorway lines, tilting their heads. Few had even an idea what was inside, and still fewer cared. In the museum's high stone halls, the bronzes were unfolded by gloved hands. The clerks followed with an air of casual remoteness, stamping boxes on paper tickets. Plaque, warrior figure, ivory mask, ceremonial head. Each was tagged not with its name, but with a clinical catalog number. The room had a distant smell of dust and oil, as if the treasures had begun to smother in their new palace. A few days later, the museum was opened to the public. The bronzes stood in line under sulky gaslight, their swirling carvings casting shadows on the museum's pale walls. Londoners moved through in hushed awe, their breath fogging the glass. They gasped at the piece, the craftsmanship, the detail, the strange faces that were imprisoned in metal. But their amazement went no further. Nobody asked who had constructed them, what they were for, or how they had come to be there. At a reception one evening, in a Union Jack bunting-covered hall, a dignitary rose. "These things are evidence of Britain's reach and of our empire's civilizing power." They cheered, clinking their wine glasses. To them, the bronzes were not living history. They were proof of conquest, representations of power, just another jewel in the crown of imperialism. But outside the golden rooms of London, in the shattered quietness of Benin, the loss was felt like an open sore. The altars of the king were bare, their ornamented sentries vanished. Festivals arrived without the sparkle of bronze in the light of the torches. Children grew up to know not the faces of their ancestors. The elders told stories to make up for the emptiness, but stories could never compensate for the heaviness of what had been lost. In the museum, a little girl pressed her palm flat against the glass, looking at a bronze head that had coral beads going around it. She asked her father, "Who is he?" The man shrugged. "Some African king, I suppose." They didn't realize his name was Oba, or that his soul, and the belief of his people, still lingered on the metal. Night fell over London, and the big doors of the museum boomed shut. The galleries lay quiet, the bronzes radiating softly in the dim light, their blind eyes staring out through the glass, waiting for the day they would see home again. They stood silent for more than a century, but silence is never the same as forgetting. The decades drifted along like idle clouds over agitated water. London changed, horse and carriage to motorcar, gas to electricity, cobble to tarmac. But in the British Museum, the bronzes lay still. They lay behind glass, each labeled in neat English letters, their history reduced on a plate to 1 or 2 words. Years went by. School parties walked by, their laughter echoing off the stone. Artists deciphered the delicate patterns, unaware that they were reproducing the essence of another group. Scholars wrote books on African metallurgy, deconstructing each curve and motif as if they were puzzles to be unraveled, never once aware that these pieces were pulled from a living tradition, as leaves are torn from a sacred book. In Benin, the scar became a token in place of the wound. The children were instructed by their elders about the day when the royal palace radiated bronze, when all was not ornamentation, when it was filled with prayer, a connection to the ancestors. The children sat in reverence, yet to them these stories were myths of another planet. They had never seen the bronzes themselves. They only glimpsed worn-out photos in books published far, far away. On other ocean shores, curators polished the artifacts for show. They called them treasures of humanity, but never spoke of returning them. They showed them under blinding lights, cordoned off with velvet ropes and security guards, as if their only value was their novelty, not their heritage. And then television. The documentaries captured tight shots of the bronzes, the angry warriors' eyes on panels, the tranquil royal faces. Housewives in their sitting rooms gazed in wonder at their grandeur but were not informed of the fire, the smoke, the blood that had been expended in bringing them to London. The story went on one-sided, an imperial fairy story with the violence removed. In the vacant corridors of nights after closing the shop, the bronzes tilted ever so slightly towards the glass, their gaze upon some point beyond the walls. They'd watched empires come and go, wars rage and smolder, the world change in ways that their makers could never have imagined. But one thing never changed: they didn't belong there. Far across, in Benin, there was a boy under the stars, looking west. His grandfather had vowed to him, "One day they will come back." He did not know when, nor how, but in the peaceful center of the bronzes, the vow still glowed. And a vow fulfilled is mightier than 100 years of silence. For more than a century, they had remained silent. But silence can be deafening. It had begun quietly enough. A query or two here, a letter there. Scholars in Nigeria were louder, no longer afraid to call the bronzes what they always had been: stolen. Their voices rang through classrooms, on the radio, and in small groups in markets and churchyards. Their elders, who had seen the conquest with their own eyes, were long years dead, but their stories did not die with them. They survived in whispers, in family lore, in the music meter of ancient poets. Something shifted in the 1970s. Post-colonial African nations looked back nostalgically to recover not just land, but soul. And part of that soul remained a captive behind museum glass thousands of miles away. Nigerian diplomats formally met with the British. The response came, polite but icy. "These objects are part of the world's common heritage." The phrase burned. Shared, but Nigeria shared no portion of it. Heritage, but sundered by war and flames. A few London journalists did go digging. A documentary crew was given privileged access to the museum archives. There, hidden away in dusty files, they found the 1897 shipping records, all the crates labeled. From Benin City, contents bronze. The evidence was compelling. But the curators were unmoved. And the demonstrations. Under the giant front doors of the British Museum in cold rain, stood Nigerian students, shivering, holding painted signs held high. "Bring them home." Pedestrians slowed to look, to ask. Some shrugged and went on. Others stopped, listening to the howls growing louder by the day. In Benin, the artists began making copies of the bronzes, not as reproductions but as defiance. Each fresh cast a declaration. "We are still here. We remember." By the 1990s, Nigerian pressure had diminished. African diaspora communities in America and Europe got organized. There were TV battles of politicians. University students staged sit-ins, demanding their universities recover looted art. Every interview, every protest placard, Every tweet was a drumbeat, constant, unrelenting, inescapable. In the quiet galleries of the British Museum, the bronzes remained in their spotlights, still but charged with new meaning. To the public at large, they were no longer beauty objects. They were now icons, not only of African art, but of colonial plunder, of unpaid accounts from the past. And for the first time in over a century, all was stirring. The stir was building. The world at last heard. And when the world hears, even the past can be altered. When something stolen subsequently comes home, the air modifications. It was a morning unlike every other. The streets of Benin City were alive before dawn, drums echoing, women making a song, antique reward songs, youngsters running barefoot via the gang. The air carried a weight, a memory, and a promise suddenly. For over a century, the Benin Bronzes had sat in the back of glass in a foreign land, their silent faces observing strangers who could not hear their language. But now, they were coming domestic. A convoy approached slowly, black vehicles moving through the group at taking walk's pace, flanked by means of soldiers in ceremonial dress. Inside one of the lead vehicles, below layers of shielding cloth and foam, were the treasures that had survived fire, blood, and exile. When the first bronze turned in to lift it out, the crowd went silent. Not a whisper, not a cough, handiest the steady hum of 1,000 hearts beating collectively. Then, as the daylight touched the historical metallic, the silence broke. A wave of sound rolled over the metropolis, cheers, ululations, the rhythmic pounding of drums so deep they seemed to shake the ground. Elders advanced, tears streaming down faces weathered through many years of waiting. Some reached out trembling fingers, however stopped just short of touching, as though afraid the bronzes would possibly vanish again. Others knelt, whispering prayers of way to ancestors who had stored the spirit of Benin alive inside the hearts of its humans. The Oba's palace gates stood open, embellished with sparkling palm fronds. Inside, the bronzes have been carried one after the other into the royal court, not as museum pieces, but as dwelling contributors of our own family coming back from a long and painful adventure. The Oba himself, wearing white coral regalia, spoke softly, his voice sporting over the crowd. You left us in fireplace. You go back in mild. And you may by no means go away once more. News cameras stuck every second, the pleasure, the tears, the records being rewritten in actual time. Around the arena, hundreds of thousands watched stay streams and information reports. For a few, it was only a cultural rite. But for the humans of Benin, it was something some distance deeper, a wound subsequently beginning to close. That night time, as celebrations lit the city, the bronzes rested under watchful eyes. Outside the palace walls, drums played till sunrise, their sound growing into the nighttime sky. And someplace, perhaps, the ancestors smiled. In returning, they gave back greater than artwork. They gave again a bit of the soul.